Welcome to lesson 4, where we're going to talk about the main body of the pattern. I know that when I started knitting, all I wanted to do was jump right into the pattern and get the stitches on my needles and create a sweater. But I learned over time that a little bit of preparation can make the knitting process a whole lot easier. Plus, you'll end up with a better finished product. And that's why it's taken us 4 lessons to get to the actual body of the pattern, let alone casting on. Now the good news is that once you learn all of these tips and tricks about how to read a pattern, you'll be able to jump in a little bit more quickly each time and know what you're looking for when you pull out that new pattern that you're so excited to knit. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about what you should be looking for when you're doing your read through of a pattern for the first time. And yes, you should be reading your pattern all the way through before you begin. We're going to talk about how to mark up a pattern to highlight your size and other important information. And I'll show you a sample markup of the Trescao pattern that we've been looking at throughout the class. I want to share 3 essential things that I think are important to reading a pattern. My first bit of advice, you've heard this before, is to read the pattern all the way through before you begin. I know, more prep work. But if you read the pattern all the way through, you'll have a better idea of how the design works, the order in which you're going to knit the parts of the garment, and how the designer is communicating the moves that they expect you to make when knitting the sweater. If you're a beginning knitter, patterns can look like a big jumble, and reading through them can seem really frustrating or daunting. However, there are ways of reading a pattern that don't require you to pay attention to all the minutiae. Instead, you're looking for keywords and key moments to highlight so that you can see them later when you're actually working through the pattern with your needles in hand. And in a moment when we read through the Trescao pattern together, I'll show you some of the keywords that you'll want to look for and highlight as you're reading through the pattern the first time. Now this leads me to my second bit of advice. Look for the moments in the pattern where there are important changes or shifts happening. For example, if there's a change in needle size, or you need to move the beginning of round marker, or you need to repeat a certain part of the pattern. Ideally, you'll have a way to highlight these moments ahead of time so that you don't miss them as you're busy working your way through the pattern. I can't tell you how many times I have forgotten to change needle size or missed a repeat because I forgot to highlight that part of the pattern enough to see it as I was quickly knitting. Now remember, knitting patterns contain a lot of noise or information that you don't necessarily need when you're knitting a single size. So you have to learn to find the key information in all that noise. Finally, you'll want to keep track of the size that you're making. Many contemporary patterns and lots of vintage patterns will include all of the sizing information in one place, separated by things like commas or different sets or kinds of parentheses. If you can highlight your size every time a long string of size differences comes up, then you'll be able to better follow the pattern successfully for the size you're intending to make as you're working it on your needles. So when I'm looking at a long string of numbers associated with a bunch of different sizes, I'm trying to identify my size, and I've got a few strategies for trying to identify that size among all the others. Strategy number 1 is to use those parentheses to your advantage. If there are different kinds of parentheses or brackets, those can help sharpen your focus. So if you know your size is within the regular parentheses, then you're always looking within those, and you can ignore everything else. The bracketed parentheses at the other end and the other numbers at the other side. Now if your size appears within a set of square brackets, then you're always looking in the square brackets, and you don't need to look at all the other sizing information. Just kind of put it out of your head. My second strategy is to simply circle or highlight your size throughout the pattern so that you can easily identify it as you're reading through and knitting up the sweater. I'll give you an example of both strategies in action once we get to the Trescao pattern. Now remember, it's okay to write all over your patterns. I give you permission. And in fact, you might thank yourself for it later. If your pattern's in a book or a magazine and you don't want to write directly on the original, consider copying those pages that you might need or seeing if you can download the pattern as a PDF that you could print out. Now, if neither of these things is an actual option, you could also use things like Post-it notes to allow you to write on the pattern without actually writing on the book or the magazine. Some people prefer digital patterns because they can make notes and marks directly on the PDF. And if that's how you'd like to work, then that's absolutely great because you can make a lot of notes on a PDF. There are some really nice tools in there, and I'll show you the markup of the Trescao pattern actually in a digital form. Now with that, I think we're ready to jump into reading our pattern and highlighting those really important bits of information about size and needles, etc. Now these are things we don't want to miss when we're actually knitting the garment, so we're going to make sure that we can identify them very easily as we're busy with our needles. I'm going to show you a screen capture of a PDF version of the Trescao pattern, and I'm going to use my mouse and my PDF reader tools to highlight things that I think are important in the pattern. I'll also be highlighting a particular size that I want to keep track of. In this case, it'll be the 110 centimeter or 44 inch bust size, which I'm looking for throughout the pattern. As you can see from the screen capture, I'm highlighting bits of information as I read through the pattern. First, I note that I'll need smaller needles for my cast on. And after that, you'll see me do my first size highlighting. Here, I highlighted the 114 stitches that I'll need to cast on for my size. Having looked at the initial size list, I know that the 110 centimeter or 44 inch bust is always at the end of those regular parentheses. So whenever I see a long string of numbers, I'm going to be looking for the one that's at the end of the regular parentheses and highlighting it. You'll also notice that I've highlighted moments in the pattern where I need to repeat a row or more, and you'll notice that I'm highlighting moments where my size is in a special place versus the rest of the sizes. When there are large paragraphs of instructions, as there are for the setup row on page 4 and for the instructions to separate the body and sleeves on page 5, I also like to highlight moments when I'm supposed to remove a marker or place a beginning of round marker in a different place. Finally, you'll see me highlighting sections of the pattern that have to do with lengths. Under the body section, for example, I highlighted the phrase, "until you reach 20 centimeter length from the underarm." In that case, I'll know that it's not about row counting, but it's about the length of the garment that I'm knitting. Of course, and as I've said from the beginning of the class, my way of reading or highlighting a pattern is just one of the ways of doing it. There are plenty of different methods, and I hope you'll develop one that works for you. The trick is highlighting enough information to be able to follow the pattern when you're in the middle of knitting, but not so much information that you're not actually helping yourself separate the information from the noise. I would also suggest holding on to your patterns after you've finished your garments. I keep an entire file of patterns that I've knit, along with swatches and notes, in addition to my Ravelry project pages. Keeping these records can help you if you want to knit a similar pattern later, or use a similar needle size on a different pattern, or achieve a similar gauge with the same yarn. Plus, it's fun to look back over your projects and your notes to see how far you've come as a knitter. If you'd like to see the complete version of my notes for this pattern, I've included the entire screen capture so that you can get a feel for how I go through the entire process from beginning to end. As we finish up this lesson on the main body of the pattern, I think it's interesting to note that it's one of the shorter lessons in this class, and that's because it's the prep work that takes the time, and the actual knitting and reading through the pattern is well, I'm not going to say a breeze, but it's relatively a smooth process once you've done all of your prep work. Now in the next and final lesson, we'll talk about some pattern management strategies, such as keeping track of where you are, cross-checking charts and written instructions, and finding places for tutorials and pattern support.